Actually, I can pose my question in English. It's not really a problem.
Okay.
Well, the question is actually rather simple despite all the words surrounding it. And that is that we have a little bit of a pseudo problem, in my opinion, here. We have a debate that you've been raising about the need to find each other again between the Eurasian Union as it is developing and the European Union. But there are some basic principles that have been broken, largely from the Russian Federation side, that make this mutual understanding very difficult. Why does the EU and why do the Western states in general, including the United States, have to make such an effort to gain this mutual understanding given the current context?
Okay, thank you very much for a question. First of all, I'm not the government, so I'm expressing my own views in this regard, and I'm not entitled to defend what the government is doing. Although, not to follow the usual pattern when there is a blame on each other, I would like to remind you that the Pandora box was not opened by Russia. So you really track it back to earlier times, including Kosovo, unfortunately. And Russia was, I'm not going to repeat Putin's words of the bear having the right to its taiga. This is out of the question. But I would say I'm more or less familiar with the negotiations that were held during the times of around Ukraine and their association agreement with the EU, and with the Ukrainian association with the customs union, because they were going parallelly. And I more or less know that, unfortunately, our European colleagues did not want to listen. What they were saying is that that is out of question, and they were not ready to discuss anything. Something exactly that was taken a year later when Yanukovych was ousted was not taken into consideration earlier. Unfortunately, at that point, Ukraine was put in front of a choice, either Russia or EU. And this is fundamentally wrong approach. We only can do it together. We cannot de-dividing. And this was exactly the division that was offered for the country, which I would never approve. And I think if you are not just providing for official position, but if you are thinking critically yourself, you would agree that we cannot impose dividing lines. Even if you do not like something about the other part of the world, you have to consider it has its own interests, as well as the other part of the world has to consider you have your own legitimate interests. So when one of the sides is not listening to each other and ignores it deliberately, this doesn't lead to any concession and any compromise. And I would say the break started not even with Kosovo. Russia at that point did go along with what was happening, although I would highly disapprove of what happened further. Primarily because it's not the people's interests that were taken into account. I know a lot of Crimeans who did want to be in Russia, but unfortunately I don't see Russia having the reason of those people interests being taken into account. It's just about geopolitics and strategy. That's why I cannot approve that. Because besides the previously broken rules of the international law, now Russia is in the same camp and cannot answer legitimately, because now it actually got into the same group with its Western colleagues that broke the international law, and that now we're more or less in the same boat, unfortunately. So it did lose its legitimacy. So, but we still taken that if we see the future of our region as a yes, Americans are in it, Euro-Atlantic area, of course. If we want to create common future, or let's say if you want to create your own peaceful, and secure future, you are sure you need to take into account interests of all parties that are existent. You cannot introduce and impose your own truth on everyone else. That's the problem. And that's why I mentioned BRICS. They have different visions of the world at some points, but they accept that their vision of the world or their cultural differences or their political differences is not something that has to be taken as a point for further arguments. It should be taken as a point for compromise. And this is something that probably Europe and United States have to relearn again. You have to understand that other players are existent. With the global balance of power shifting, they are no longer eager to take the dictatorship, and probably Russia is a less of a case. China would be much more important play in this regard, and you will have to take into account what China thinks as well in Asia Pacific or globally. So this is the case. If you want secure future primarily for yourself, you have to take into account not only your own proper interests, but the interests of other players that have legitimate right to be there.
Sì, io pregherei la professoressa Panova di tornare un attimo al Mediterraneo. Cioè, noi ci troviamo davanti all'opportunità di una integrazione della parte est con il resto del Mediterraneo, Mar Nero, Mar Caspio e quindi tutto ciò che ruota intorno, si articola intorno a questo. Ecco, la Russia che ruolo può avere in una politica mediterranea? Ecco, questo credo che sia una cosa che può interessare molto.
By all means, I would certainly agree with you. If it's not against taken with the view that, okay, let's create something like a pipeline that would surpass Russia in the united area, then Russia would certainly welcome it. So if it takes into account economic, political, social interests of all sides, it will be a welcome sign, because probably when you were listening to Valdai's speech, you heard a lot of confrontational notes, while there were a lot of invitations which might have been overheard by people in Putin's speech. He is, although Russia is turning a lot to the east, it's really wanting to go back and to try again to mend its fences with the west, with the south. So areas where the Russia and Mediterranean and Black Sea and Caspian can play a role. First of all, as I said, let's start with social and economic areas, because military is most difficult. That's why you didn't start your integration with the military area. It didn't work out. Probably agreeing on a new energy compact. So you remember the Energy Charter Treaty did fail, if we talk about Eurasian aspect of it. So probably for that area, it would be an important step to, let's start with energy issues, something like that, or creating a common, I'm not saying now, I'm not going as far as creating a free trade area. It's impossible, but establishing some kind of mechanism that would allow to arbitrate on, let's say, economic connections, economic interlinks between the countries involved in the area. Besides, I mean, while some people try to counterpose Russia against Europe, as I said, I mean, being in Italy is probably the most appropriate place, because Russians and Italians are so similar in many aspects, in psychological aspects, in cultural aspects, in approaches to business as well. So I think probably Italy, as a neutral, more or less neutral power within Europe, could suggest a number of initiatives with which Russia would go along, I'm quite sure, on this area. But I said, let's start with economy and social cultural aspects.